So I just want to emphasize how, even though we made some associations between specific lobes of the brain, specific chunks of cortex, and particular sort of perceptual functions or cognitive functions, etc. Any complex cognitive ability is going to actually involve sort of what we call distributed networks. It's going to be areas of cortex, what we call gray matter. Gray matter is actually the neuron cell bodies and the dendrites that come off the cell body, right? All these dendrites and the synaptic connections that link synaptically, from one neuron to the next. So here's the axon terminals of one, with all the presynaptic receptors we described, signaling chemically with the postsynaptic membrane of the next cell. So this piece here, this part of your brain here, your nervous system here, this is what we call gray matter. And a great deal of gray matter is in the cortex. There's also, we're going to see some pretty important, gray matter, clumps of it that are located in deeper structures in the brain, sort of subcortically below the cortex. And these are called nuclei. Which is always confusing because the nucleus, right, is also where the DNA is inside the cell body, inside the soma. But a nucleus, referring to a larger scale structure in the brain, is a clump of gray matter. It's a whole bunch of neurons, a whole bunch of cellular nuclei here, but with the dendrites and also the synaptic connections being made at the same time. So the rest of the brain, below the cortex, and around the nuclei is this stuff. This is the white matter. And, the white matter is the cabling, the axons that are actually carrying information from one area of gray matter to another. And they're sort of, connecting structurally. And also, as you're developing, they're developing a sort of functional coordination. They fire sort of simultaneously. They can share information there. You'll see activity and, blood flow rise in one and the other in areas in networks, networked regions that are functionally coordinating to allow you to pay attention or to make decisions or to remember or to ruminate or, whatever it is you happen to be doing. So any complex cognitive ability is going to involve, distributed, connected regions across many lobes. And I just want to show you, actually, I've got something you can sort of see here. This is actually what they call a coronal slice of the human brain. This is an actual individual's, part of an actual individual's brain, and it's coronal. So it basically slid out this way, forms a corona around the head, the coronavirus. So you can see very closely here, very easily here, like that surface region here. Here's the surface portion that's sticking up that's kind of darker in color. That's the cortex, and that's a gyrus. And then it sort of descends below here and then comes back up. That's a valley, right? That's the that's a sulcus basically in there. So you got the gyri along the surface here and here, and then the sulci going down and the sulci going down. And this is actually showing you that great big fissure too, right here. Here's the temporal lobe, right? This could be, probably the parietal lobe over here because there's a little piece of the brainstem over there. And this is showing you in here, you go all the way in through this fissure, this lateral fissure, right? Let me see if I do it this way. All the way through this lateral fissure, and then down here, and then up here. This section back in here is the insular lobe, right? This is where you're getting all these visceral kind of afferents, all these, like, the sensory input about, how your body is doing, which is going to have a huge impact, basically on, what you do and on your behavior. So this is a really good illustration. Then you can also see deeper down here, there's some darker patches here. These are subcortical nuclei, including we're going to see this set here and this over here. This is part of what we call the basal ganglia. That's going to play a very big role in sort of drug use disorders. So this image just shows you, for example, how, if you're talking about a complex cognitive ability, let's say like language, right? Well, language involves, both comprehension and also production or expression, right? And it turns out there was a very simplistic kind of view put forth, over 100 years ago that really had a great deal of impact, on how we think about language in the brain. And we've, subsequently been, adding tremendous complexity to the networks that are actually involved in both comprehension and production. But initially, neurologists sort of identified, a specific region in the left frontal lobe known as Broca's area that was important for, sort of planning the expression. The motor planning, again, that's a function of the frontal lobe, right? Sort of preparation for expression, called Broca's area. And then, in the temporal lobe, there was a region that was identified by another neurologist named Carl Wernicke that seemed to be pretty essential for the extraction of information from whether you were hearing something, or you were reading something, or you were doing braille. Didn't matter which form it came in. This region seemed to be pretty critical for extracting information and understanding and comprehending language. And these two areas were linked, by white matter connections, by the axons. So they shared information. And again, I just want to make it clear. I'm pointing this out because something complicated like language, for example, is going to definitely involve areas of the brain beyond a single lobe. However, the comprehension aspects that involve sort of auditory input, for example, and visual input, that's going to be more posterior, associated with temporal lobe for the auditory input, for example. And the motor aspects, the expressive aspects of language, are going to involve areas in the frontal lobe. And they're linked together. It's much more complicated than just Wernicke's and Broca's. There are many other areas that are involved in both comprehension and expression, but there is more of a posterior and an anterior network. And so any complex cognitive ability is not just confined to the networking in one single lobe. Same is true, we're going to see with social decision making. How you feel, how your insula is actually mapping the current state of your body, or your perceived state of the body, is going to have an influence over, frontal decision making. Do you want to do this? If you say, do I want to do this? And you go, no, I don't. You can actually feel your body. There's crosstalk. There's communication between these different regions. Or, if you see something and you want it, you feel quite motivated. And, that can drive decision making too.